SSIS, moving packages. You're going to spend a good majority of your time in a development environment. It's probably going to be on a different server compared to your production environment, and the database that you're pulling information from might be named differently, and the files that you're dumping to might be named differently as well. You need to take these things into consideration in your development environment, because if you hard code all this information, everything's going to break in your production environment if you don't take the necessary precautions. In this nugget, we're going to focus on configurations, and we're going to be focusing on XML configurations and then indirect XML configurations. Essentially, a configuration is a name-value pair where you can plug in variable pieces of information. For example, the database name that you're pulling from, or the data file name that you're writing out to. We'll take a look at how to make this dynamic using environment variables and with XML files. Then we'll take a closer look at security. You want to make sure that when you're executing a package that you apply the appropriate security. For example, you can password protect sensitive information, so then when somebody tries to run the package, it will prompt them for that password. I'll show you how to deploy your packages. There's 3 different locations to deploy. You have the file system level, you have the file store level, as well as the SQL Server database level. Then at the end of this nugget, we will execute our packages in 2 different ways. We can do it through a graphical interface, or we can use the command line dtexec, which scales pretty well if you need to go through a loop and execute a number of packages all at once. Well, let's get started with our configurations. In SSIS, when you're in a development environment, the data that you're pulling, the databases or the tables that you're pulling from, might be different from the tables you're pulling from in a production environment. If you're spilling information out to a flat file, that path might also be different as well. And so what you want to do is make your packages as portable as possible to make migration very easy. So what we're going to do here is, in our development environment, we have an empty solution here. It's called deployment test, and we're going to have a package in there that has just a data flow task, and all we're going to be doing is pulling information from a database table, sorting it, and then spilling it out to a flat file. So as I mentioned, the configurable parts here might be the server name and the table name that you're pulling from, as well as the flat file. So I'm going to right click on my SSIS package. We're going to create a new package here, and let's go ahead and just rename this. We'll call this sort package, and we're just going to say yes on there. And so now we can drag on here a data flow task, double click on that, and then define what we want to do. So our data flow source is going to be OLEDB. We can double click on that to define it. So we're going to just say new connection manager, and our server name, my server name is Julie1, and my table name is AdventureWorks DW2008. So I'll hit OK on there, and we are going to be pulling from the customer table. Our next step, I'm just going to perform a sort operation. So I just drag sort over here and then drag this green arrow. We can double click on sort to specify what we're sorting by. So we're going to sort by the last name and then the first name. And then our last thing we're going to do is spill this out to a flat file. So scroll down here, flat file destination, drag this arrow over here, and then double click on your flat file destination. And here we're going to say new connection manager, and let's make this just the limited. And we'll just call this my flat file connection manager. You can put a description in there if you want to, and I'm going to have this spill out to a file called sortedcust.csv. Now, I'm going to go to our mappings, and okay, that looks good. We'll hit OK right there. And just to test this, just right click on there and go ahead and execute the package. We should see green across the board, which means everything succeeded. Okay, that looks great. We can go ahead and stop the debugging process, and if you want to double check your work, you can do that. Okay, so here's our file, and you'll see that these are in alphabetical order, so that looks great. Let me move this out of the way. Our next step is to enable this to be configurable. So we're just going to double click on here and then go to SSIS and say Package Configurations, and we want to enable it. Now there's different types of configurations. By far the most common one is an XML configuration file, and what it does is we're going to use this wizard to spill this to an XML file, then we use a text editor to make whatever modifications we want to. Other options, you can specify your configurable options by using an environment variable or a Windows registry entry. If you have a package calling another package, you might specify a parent package variable, or you can even store the configurable information in a SQL Server database table. So as I mentioned, most of the time it's an XML configuration file. Now, there's two options for this XML config file as far as where it's located. If you want to hard code it, you can just specify where you want it stored. For example, I might say sorted cust.config. Hard code that value in. If I don't want to hard code the value, I can specify it with an environment variable, which is considered even better. So then when you're in your new environment, all you have to do is change the environment variable, and you don't have to modify any files. For right now, we're going to specify the configuration file name hard-coded. So now we'll hit Next right here, and I'm just going to go ahead and overwrite. So at this point, it asks us, what do we want to make configurable? Well, if you scroll up here, let's just focus on our connection managers. Here's the connection manager to tap into our database. We can make the connection string configurable, and this is where you can specify the data source server as well as the table name, any username, password, anything like that. Okay, so here, your flat file connection manager, if you expand that, go to properties, and you can modify your connection string right there. Okay, so we hit Next, and we'll just call this My Configuration, and then hit Finish. Hit Close, and now if you open up a text editor, you can see this XML file. Now it's a little bit difficult to read, but if you open this up in a browser, it will be a lot easier to read since it's XML, and the browser will indent things really nicely for you. We're looking for two things here. We're looking for the configurable flat file name as well as the configurable connection string. And so let's see here. We're finding, here is the AdventureWorks DW 2008. And here, Julie1 is the name of the server. So as I mentioned, once you move this somewhere else, you can change that if you want to. And you'll see down here, we have sorted cust.csv. If you wanted to modify that, you could do that as well. So now whenever we run this package, it's going to use whatever values you've plugged in right here. Just to prove that to you, I'm going to change this here to be called customers.csv, and then I'll save this. And now we can run our package. So let's execute our package right here. Give it a few seconds. And then you can open up your text editor, and here is my customers.csv file. So we know that that's working. So we are in the development environment right now. If we want to deploy this somewhere else, either on a different server or on a different instance of SQL Server, we can do that. So the easiest way to do the deployment, first of all, you're going to have to bundle it up. If you right-click on your project right there and right-click on Properties, you'll see that we have the configuration properties. Click on Deployment Utility, and you want to say Create Deployment Utility. I want you to set that to True. And now we can hit Apply and OK. Now you can build this by right-clicking on it and just say Build, or you can say Rebuild. And what this is going to do is it's going to create a directory for you. In fact, when you right-click on this, let's look at it again. When we look at our properties, you'll see that the deployment output path is bin/deployment. Now you might not see that directory up in here, but if you actually go to your directory system on the operating system, you'll see it. So I have my Windows Explorer right here, and I'll pull this up right here, you'll see that I have my deployment test right there, and yes, there is my bin directory. And if you want to add any miscellaneous files, you can. For example, you might want to include a README file. So I'm just going to drill down to my deployment right here, and I'm going to create a directory. I'll just say new folder, and I'll just call this miscellaneous. And under miscellaneous, I will put a README file. So just right click on there, and I'll just say text document, and I'll just call this readme.txt. Open this with a text editor, and we'll just put in the author information and the date and any contact information. Okay, so we'll go ahead and save this, move this out of the way. So now this gets bundled with the deployment. Now that we have our little bundle of joy, we can migrate this to another server, or we might deploy it on the same server but a different instance of SQL Server. We're going to use the deployment utility to do this. So I'm going to just go up a directory. You'll see that if you hover over this right here, this is the Integration Services Deployment Manifest. This just contains metadata about what we're deploying. Now make sure that it's associated with the proper type of program. If you have this associated with Internet Explorer or Firefox, then it's just going to display that information in a browser. So we want this to be associated with the SSIS deployment utility. Okay, let's pretend like we want to deploy this on a different server. What we want to do is create a share so that server can access this directory. So if I go up one directory, here's my deployment, I can right click on here and I can say share, and I can change the sharing permissions. And right here I can hit this drop down and just say I can share it with everyone, and then say share. Now that it's shared, you can connect from another machine that's networked to this machine and drill down to this deployment right here. You can copy it. You can just right click and do a copy and then paste it anywhere you want to. So what I'm going to do is pretend like I'm on two separate machines. I'm just going to copy it right here and maybe copy this directly to the Julie Documents directory. So I'll just right click on here and say paste. Okay, so you'll see that that deployment folder is now there, and inside that deployment folder, if you hover over here, this is the deployment manifest. I just go ahead and double click on this, and it should launch this package installation wizard. So now you can hit next, and you specify where it's going to be deployed to. So you can do file system deployment, you can deploy it to SQL Server, and it's also a good idea to validate the packages just to make sure that everything looks good after deployment. So in this example, I'm going to deploy to SQL Server, and then I hit next. The server name, in my case, is Julie1 or localhost. You can specify what kind of authentication. I'm going to stick with Windows authentication. And you can also rely on the server storage for encryption. So here under package path, if you click on the ellipsis, you'll see that we have this structure right here, and this is the structure inside of SQL Server. If you were to select the file system, then you would see the C drive and everything else in there. So here's my Julie1. I'll just deploy it directly to there, and then hit next. And then it shows us the folder where it's going to. If you want to deploy this to somewhere else, you can. For example, I might go directly to my C drive, and I might just call this, create a new folder, and call this deploy test 1, and then hit OK, and then hit next. So this will take a few seconds to a couple minutes, depending on how large your packages are. And you'll see that, remember, we created that configuration file, and if you expand this, it's asking where you want to have these. So if you want to override, maybe we want to call this customers1.csv. You can even change the data source if you want. I'm going to leave the data source the same. But let's say that in your production environment, the server was no longer Julie1. It was, some other name. You can either put the name or the IP address in there. And now we'll hit next. And it looks like validation completed. We can hit next and then finish. If we want to double check our work, we can go to SSMS. And when we connect, make sure that you connect to the integration services. I'm going to minimize this window a little bit. And you should see something like this. If you look under stored packages, expand that, go to MSDB, here is Julie 1, and there is that sort package right there. So to test this, we could just right click on it and say run package. Here's the metadata. So here's general information about our package, and you'll see down here under the command line that this is the command that's going to get executed. This is the DT exec, and if you wanted to modify that, you can always say edit the command line manually and provide the different options. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and execute this. Everything is looking good. Almost finished. There we go, we're finished. I'm going to hit close and then close again. Now remember, when we modified our configuration parameters, we specified to go directly under the C drive to a file called customers1.csv, and just to verify, here it is. So we know that this is working. Now when we deployed this, we didn't set any of the security options, so that's what I want to talk to you about right now. Let's go back to our Business Intelligence Development Studio, and we can double click on our package right here. And actually you can do this on the package level or the data task level. You can do it on several different levels. But let's take a look at our properties here. And you want to scroll down until you see security. And here's where you can attach a password to a package. So when you are running it on the target machine, the user has to provide that password. So I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to type in the new password. And it's not going to show up here at all. That's okay. Now you'll see here that we have different protection levels. If we click on here, we have encrypt sensitive with user key. We can encrypt sensitive information with a password. We can encrypt everything with a password or encrypt everything with a user key, or specify security on the server storage level. If we want to encrypt everything with a password, we select that right there, and then we can click on this ellipsis and set the password right there. So I'm going to hit OK. And even though it's not showing up in there, it is storing the password. And so then you would deploy just like we did a minute ago, and then when you run your package, it's going to prompt you for the password. How does SQL Server know what's sensitive and what's not? Well, there's certain things that it knows that are sensitive. For example, connection strings. That's definitely sensitive. Passwords, usernames, anything like that. Security-wise, there's something else that you can configure from your SSMS. Let's go back there. And you'll see that there's the deployed package. If you right-click on it, you'll see that we have package roles. So if we click on that, here's the package name, and you can specify which roles are able to read and write here. So you can change whatever role you want. So if somebody belongs to that role, for example, if somebody belongs to the data reader role, if you select that, then they'll be able to read this and so on. I'm going to stick with the defaults right now. Okay, so now that we've covered the security part, I just want to show you what happens when you try to open up your project in Business Intelligence Development Studio with that password applied. So we're going to open up BIDS right here, and we'll just say File, Open, Project, and here it is right here, Deployment Test. Double click on this guy right here, and we'll get this prompt that asks for the password that we entered earlier. So I'll hit OK. And you might get a little warning saying that we have some files with extremely long lines of text. Just go ahead and say yes on there. That's fine. So we know that our password protection is working. Now back to the configuration file issue. Remember earlier we hard-coded a configuration file, and I said that it was considered a better practice to use an environment variable to store the location of that configuration file. So I want to show you that right now. We're going to make sure that you have your sort package here selected, and then we'll go to SSIS, go to our package configurations, and we can just click on here and we can say remove. And then this time we're going to add a different kind. Once again, this will be an XML configuration file, but we're going to store this as an environment variable. So I'll just call this environment variable config_file. Then I hit next and hit finish, and then close. Now, how do you make this an environment variable? Well, there's two ways you can do this. You can make this a permanent environment variable by setting it on the computer properties level, or you can just make it more of a temporary setting within a DOS window. I'm just going to open up a DOS window, and now we'll just set it here in this window. So we'll say set config file equals, and let's call this, let's just put it directly under the C drive. We'll call this myconfig1 dot, make sure it has the .dtsconfig extension. And the next thing we want to do is we want to make sure that this file actually exists and it contains the configuration information. And now what you should be able to do is just open up a text editor, find that existing dtsconfig file, and we can make some changes in there, make any tweaks that we want to. So you'll see here this is myconfig.dtsconfig, so that looks good. And now we're going to change the name of that. So just do a save as. And then we'll just put a 1 right here. .dtsconfig. And then we can save it. Once again, any modifications you want to make to this, go ahead and do that. For example, we might decide to change the connection string in here. Do whatever changes you find appropriate. Okay, so I'm going to close this up right now. Once you have everything the way you'd like it in your config file, then let's go ahead and go to a command prompt, and we're going to execute it on the command line using dtexec. Earlier we used our graphical interface to execute a package. You can do that from the command line as well. So it's called dtexec. This command should be in your path, so really it doesn't matter which directory you're sitting in when you execute this. There's three main options to choose from. You can execute a package on the file system, in a file store, or in the database. I'm going to execute, if I say dtexec/sq, and remember mine was under msdb Julie1, and then the name of it was sort package. And looks like everything executed just fine. We have an exit status code of 0, which means success. If you wanted to make this scale, maybe you wanted to loop through multiple packages to execute them, you could create a loop and do this on the command line. So it really does scale when you do things on the command line rather than through the graphical interface. Let's review what we learned in this nugget. We first of all talked about the reasons for using configurations. Remember, the main motivation for using a configuration is to avoid hard-coding values such as file names, database table names, usernames, and passwords. The most common way of creating a configuration is through XML files, and you can specify, you can hard-code the name of that XML file, or you can do it indirectly through an environment variable. Remember, we created an environment variable that pointed to the name of our configuration XML file. Then we took a look at security. If you go to the properties of your package, you'll see a security section, And that's where you can password protect sensitive information. So you can actually do it through passwords or through encryption keys. Then when you try to run a package or open up a package, it's going to prompt you for that information. Then we talked about deployment. When you set a package ready for deployment, it's going to create an extra directory, and by default it will go under the bin deployment folder. Inside of there you can add any auxiliary files such as a README file to provide contact information and things like that. When you create that deployment bundle, you're going to have a manifest file with the extension of dtsconfig, and then to install that deployment somewhere else, you simply double click on it and it will take you through the wizard, asking you the necessary questions. Then the last thing we talked about is executing your deployed packages. We have the command line dtexec utility, and we also have the graphical interface. If you need to execute a lot of packages in a loop, the best way to do that is using dtexec. Well, I hope this has been informative, and I'd like to continue doing.